Lone rancher saved a native infant. At dawn, 100 warriors stood guard without saying a word. Welcome, amazing viewers, to another extraordinary tale that will remind you why acts of courage and compassion echo through generations. Before we dive into this incredible story set in the untamed wilderness of 1880s Montana Territory, I absolutely need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. Yes, right this moment. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling us exactly where you're watching this from. Are you cozy at home in Chicago? Maybe you're listening while commuting in London. Perhaps you're taking a break from work in Mumbai or relaxing on a beautiful evening in Sydney. We have viewers from every corner of the planet, and hearing from you truly makes our day. Your comments and engagement help us bring you more of these powerful stories that touch the heart and soul. Now settle in as we transport you to the rugged frontier of Montana Territory, where a solitary cattle rancher named Jacob "Jake" Thornfield will make a choice that defies everything his neighbors believe about survival, loyalty, and what it means to be human. This is a story about an unexpected discovery, a life or death decision, and how one man's compassion will bring him face to face with honor in its purest form. Chapter 1. The Cry in the Wilderness. The late September sun beat down mercilessly on the vast expanse of Montana grassland as Jacob Thornfield rode the fence line of his modest ranch. At 45, Jake had spent the better part of 2 decades carving out a living from this unforgiving land, building his spread from nothing more than determination and backbreaking work. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the easy confidence of a man who had learned to read the moods of both horses and weather with equal skill. Jake's ranch, the Circle T, was neither the largest nor the most prosperous in Clearwater County, but it was his earned through years of 18-hour days and winters that tested the limits of human endurance. He ran about 300 head of cattle across 5,000 acres of deeded land and grazing rights, enough to provide a modest living for a man with simple needs and no family to support. The isolation of ranch life suited Jake perfectly. After losing his wife Martha to cholera 7 years earlier, he had found solace in the rhythm of working with animals and the vast silence of the Montana landscape. Most of his neighbors thought him too much of a loner, but Jake preferred the honest companionship of horses and cattle to the complicated politics and prejudices that seemed to dominate conversations in the nearby town of Clearwater Falls. As he rode along the northern boundary of his property, checking for breaks in the barbed wire fence that kept his cattle from wandering into the badlands beyond, Jake's attention was caught by his horse's sudden alertness. Duke, his steady bay gelding, had his ears pricked forward and was staring intently toward a cluster of cottonwoods that marked the location of Willow Creek. "What is it, boy?" Jake murmured, following the horse's gaze. At first, Jake heard nothing but the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle, but then, carried on the afternoon breeze, came a sound that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable cry of a human infant. Jake spurred Duke toward the trees, his mind racing. The nearest homestead was more than 10 miles away, and the country between here and there was rough enough to challenge even experienced travelers. What was a baby doing alone in this wilderness? As he approached the creek, Jake dismounted and tied Duke to a sturdy cottonwood before making his way carefully through the undergrowth. The crying was coming from somewhere just ahead, near the water's edge. What Jake found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Partially hidden beneath a pile of brush and debris that had clearly been arranged by human hands, Jake discovered an infant who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The baby was wrapped in a beautifully crafted blanket of soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that Jake recognized as Native American craftsmanship. Despite the careful wrapping, the child was clearly in distress, crying weakly with the sound of exhaustion and hunger. Jake knelt beside the makeshift hiding place and gently lifted the infant, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the small bundle. It was a boy, Jake realized, and despite his obvious ordeal, he appeared to be healthy and uninjured. The quality of the blanket and the careful way the child had been hidden suggested that someone had gone to great lengths to protect him. "Where's your mama, little fellow?" Jake whispered, looking around the area for any sign of the child's parents or family. It didn't take long for Jake to piece together what had happened. The ground around the creek showed clear signs of a violent struggle: hoofprints from multiple horses, spent shell casings, and dark stains in the earth that could only be blood. Someone had made a desperate last stand here, and in their final moments, They had hidden the baby with the hope that he might survive even if they didn't. Jake's jaw tightened as he studied the evidence. The hoof prints and other signs pointed to a raid by white men, probably the kind of vigilante groups that had been terrorizing Native American families throughout the territory. The territorial government's official policy might speak of peaceful coexistence, but the reality on the ground was far more brutal. As Jake held the crying infant, he found himself facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to take the baby to town and turn him over to the authorities. The territorial government had established orphanages specifically for Native American children, institutions designed to civilize them by stripping away their cultural identity and remaking them in the image of white society. But Jake had seen these institutions during his occasional trips to the territorial capital. He had seen the hollow eyes of children who had been separated from everything they had ever known, forced to abandon their language, their beliefs, and their very sense of who they were. The thought of condemning this innocent child to such a fate made Jake feel physically sick. The baby's crying was growing weaker, and Jake realized that the child was approaching the limits of his endurance. Whatever decision he was going to make, he needed to make it quickly. Jake looked down at the small face, noting the fine features and the shock of black hair that marked the child's heritage. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Jake's worldview. This wasn't a political problem or a cultural issue. This was simply a helpless baby who needed someone to care for him. "Well, little man," Jake said softly, "I guess you're coming home with me." The ride back to the ranch house was one of the longest of Jake's life. The infant, whom Jake had decided to call Danny until he could learn the child's real name, had quieted somewhat when fed some water from Jake's canteen, but he was clearly in need of proper food and care. Jake found himself constantly checking to make sure the baby was still breathing, terrified that the child might not survive the journey. Jake's ranch house was a modest but well-built structure of log and stone, designed to withstand the brutal Montana winters. It consisted of a main room with a large stone fireplace, a separate bedroom, and a small kitchen area where Jake prepared his simple meals. It had been built for a bachelor's needs, but as Jake carried Danny inside, he realized he was going to have to make some significant changes. The first challenge was food. Jake knew enough about infants to understand that cow's milk could be dangerous for such a young baby, but it was the only option available. He diluted the milk with water and warmed it over the fire, then fashioned a feeding device from a clean rag soaked in the mixture. To his relief, Danny took the improvised feeding eagerly, his small hands grasping at Jake's fingers with surprising strength. As the baby fed, Jake found himself studying the intricate beadwork on the blanket, recognizing patterns that suggested the child came from one of the Blackfoot bands that ranged through this part of Montana. As evening fell and Danny finally slept, exhausted from his ordeal, Jake sat beside the fire and contemplated what he had gotten himself into. By taking in this Native American infant, he was violating both the law and the social expectations of his community. If his neighbors discovered what he had done, the consequences could range from social ostracism to outright violence. But as Jake watched the peaceful expression on the sleeping baby's face, he knew he had made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. This child would have a chance at life, and if Jake had anything to say about it, it would be a good life. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding Jake of the approaching winter. He had no idea how dramatically his world was about to change, or that his act of compassion had already set in motion events that would bring both danger and unexpected honor to his isolated ranch. Chapter 2. The Secret Life. The first month of caring for Danny proved to be both the most challenging and most rewarding period of Jake's adult life. The rugged rancher who had spent years living alone suddenly found himself learning the intricacies of infant care through trial and error, with no one to guide him but his own instincts and common sense. Jake's daily routine was completely transformed. Where once he had risen before dawn to tend to his cattle and spend long days working the range, he now found his schedule dictated by the needs of a demanding baby. Danny required feeding every few hours, and Jake quickly learned to recognize the different types of cries that indicated hunger, discomfort, or simple loneliness. The feeding situation had improved considerably once Jake made a trip to Clearwater Falls and carefully purchased supplies that would help him care for an infant without revealing why he needed them. He told the store owner, a gossipy woman named Mrs. Henderson, that he was buying supplies for a neighbor's new baby, and he spread his purchases across several days to avoid suspicion. Jake also made discreet inquiries about infant care, claiming he was curious about his neighbor's child. From these conversations, he learned to prepare more suitable milk formulas and gained basic knowledge about the care and handling of babies. It was a delicate balancing act, gathering information without revealing his true purpose. As the weeks passed, Jake was amazed by how quickly Danny was developing. The infant, who had been so weak and listless when Jake found him, was now alert and responsive, his dark eyes following Jake's movements around the cabin and his small hands reaching for objects that caught his attention. The baby had gained weight and lost the gaunt appearance that had been so alarming during those first few days. Jake found himself talking to Danny constantly, narrating his daily activities and sharing his thoughts about ranch life. It was oddly comforting to have someone to talk to, even if that someone couldn't understand or respond. The profound loneliness that had been Jake's constant companion since Martha's death began to ease in ways he hadn't expected. "You're going to be a strong one, aren't you, Danny?" Jake would say as he fed the baby. "I can see it in your eyes. You've got the look of someone who's going to make his mark on this world." But Jake's new life was not without its challenges and dangers. Living in such an isolated area had always provided him with privacy. But now that privacy had become essential for Danny's safety, Jake lived in constant fear that someone might discover the baby's presence and report it to the authorities. The closest call came in late October, when Tom Bradley, a neighboring rancher, stopped by unexpectedly to discuss the possibility of pooling resources for a cattle drive the following spring. Jake had just put Danny down for a nap when he saw Tom riding up the path to the house. "Jake," Tom called out as he dismounted, "hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced." "Not at all, Tom," Jake replied, stepping out onto the porch and carefully closing the door behind him. "What brings you out this way?" As they discussed business, Jake found himself straining to listen for any sounds from inside the house. Danny had been fussy that morning, and Jake prayed the baby would remain asleep during Tom's visit. To his relief, their conversation concluded without incident, but the experience left Jake shaken. He realized how vulnerable his situation really was. As winter approached, Jake faced new challenges. The ranch work that had once consumed his days now had to be compressed into the hours when Danny was sleeping, and even then, Jake couldn't venture far from the house. He hired 2 seasonal hands to help with the cattle, telling them he was dealing with some health issues that kept him close to home. The hired hands, Miguel Santos and his son Carlos, were hard-working men who asked few questions and seemed content to handle the day-to-day operations of the ranch in exchange for fair wages and a warm place to sleep in the bunkhouse. Jake was careful to keep them away from the main house, claiming he valued his privacy and didn't want to be disturbed during his recovery. During the long winter evenings, Jake began to think seriously about Danny's future. The child was clearly of Native American heritage, and Jake knew that he would eventually need to learn about his cultural background and identity. But how could Jake provide that education when he himself knew so little about Native American customs and beliefs? Jake also worried about what would happen as Danny grew older. An infant could be hidden relatively easily, but a walking, talking child would be much harder to conceal. Eventually, Jake would have to make some difficult decisions about how to integrate Danny into the wider world without putting him in danger. As Christmas approached, Jake found himself experiencing the holiday season in a completely new way. For the first time in years, he had someone to celebrate with, even if that someone was too young to understand the significance of the occasion. Jake fashioned simple toys from wood and cloth, delighting in Danny's reactions to these new objects. "Your first Christmas, little man," Jake said, as he watched Danny play with a wooden rattle. "I know it's not much, but it's made with love." Danny had begun to show clear preferences for certain people, and Jake was gratified to realize that he had become the center of the baby's world. When Danny was upset, only Jake's voice could calm him. When the baby was hungry or tired, he would reach for Jake with complete trust and confidence. The bond between the gruff rancher and the Native American infant had grown stronger than Jake had ever imagined possible. Danny had filled a void in Jake's life that he hadn't even realized existed, bringing joy and purpose to days that had previously been marked only by the endless routine of ranch work. But as 1881 dawned, Jake began to notice changes in the political climate that made him increasingly nervous about Danny's safety. Tensions between white settlers and Native American tribes were escalating throughout the territory. Fueled by competing claims to land and resources, the territorial newspapers were filled with inflammatory articles about the Indian problem, and Jake heard increasingly hostile rhetoric whenever he visited town. More troubling were the reports of vigilante groups that were taking matters into their own hands, conducting raids on Native American settlements and claiming to act in the interests of public safety. Jake realized that if Danny's presence on his ranch were discovered, both of their lives could be in serious danger. As winter began to give way to spring, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer keep Danny's existence a secret indefinitely, and he needed to find a way to protect the child while honoring his heritage. But Jake had no idea that events were already in motion that would soon bring the outside world to his isolated ranch in ways he could never have anticipated. The answer to his dilemma would come from an unexpected source, and it would test everything Jake believed about courage, honor, and the true meaning of family. Chapter 3. Discovery and Danger. The trouble began on a crisp morning in early March when Jake discovered horse tracks near the southern boundary of his property. The tracks were fresh, made sometime during the night, and they followed a pattern that suggested reconnaissance rather than casual travel. Someone had been watching his ranch, and that knowledge sent a chill down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Jake had become increasingly careful about his movements over the past few months, but he realized now that his precautions might not have been enough. Danny was nearly 10 months old now, walking with the unsteady determination of a toddler and babbling in a mixture of sounds that seemed to include both English words and what Jake suspected might be elements of his native language. The child was becoming more active and more vocal, making it increasingly difficult to keep his presence secret. As Jake studied the tracks, he noticed something that made his situation even more precarious. Mixed in with the hoofprints were the distinctive marks left by military-issue boots. Whoever had been surveilling his ranch had connections to either the territorial militia or the federal cavalry units that were stationed throughout Montana. Jake returned to the house to find Danny playing on the floor with the wooden blocks Jake had carved for him, his dark eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. The sight of the happy child made Jake's heart ache with the knowledge that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered. "We might have to take a little trip, Danny boy," Jake said softly, kneeling beside the child. "Sir, just you and me, heading somewhere safe until things calm down." But before Jake could finalize any plans for escape, his worst fears were realized. That afternoon, as he was working in the barn while Danny napped in the house, Jake heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop. Through the barn door, he saw a group of 6 men riding hard toward his ranch house, their intentions clearly hostile. Jake recognized the leader immediately, Captain William Morrison, a career military officer who commanded the territorial militia unit based in Clearwater Falls. Morrison was known throughout the region for his inflexible views on what he called the Indian question, and his belief that all Native Americans should be confined to reservations or eliminated entirely. Behind Morrison rode 5 men who were clearly civilians, including Tom Bradley, Jake's neighbor, and several other ranchers from the area. They were all armed, and their grim expressions suggested they had come prepared for violence. Jake's mind raced as he considered his options. He could try to hide Danny and bluff his way through whatever confrontation was coming, but he suspected that these men already knew about the child's presence. Someone had betrayed him, and now both he and Danny were in mortal danger. The men dismounted and surrounded the ranch house, their weapons drawn and ready. Morrison approached the front door, while the others took positions that would prevent any escape. "Jacob Thornfield," Morrison called out. "This is Captain Morrison of the Territorial Militia. We have credible information that you are harboring an Indian child in violation of territorial law. Come out with your hands visible and surrender the child immediately." Jake stepped out of the barn, his hands raised but his expression defiant. "Captain Morrison," he said calmly, "what brings you to my ranch?" "Don't play games with me, Thornfield," Morrison snapped. "We know you've got an Indian baby in there. Hand him over and we might go easy on you." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake replied, though he knew his denial was futile. Morrison nodded to 2 of his men, who immediately kicked in the front door and entered the house. Within moments, they emerged carrying a crying Danny, who was clearly terrified by the rough handling and the presence of so many hostile strangers. Jake's heart broke as he saw the fear in Danny's eyes, but he forced himself to remain calm. Any sudden movement or aggressive action would only make the situation worse for both of them. "So went well," Morrison said with cruel satisfaction as he examined Danny. "Just as reported, a healthy Indian child, being raised by a white man in direct violation of territorial policy." He turned to Jake with an expression of disgust. "What were you thinking, Thornfield? Did you really believe you could hide this indefinitely?" "He's just a baby," Jake said quietly. "He wasn't hurting anyone. He's an Indian," Morrison replied flatly, "and Indians belong on reservations, not on white ranches being raised with white ideas." He gestured to one of his men. "Take the child. He'll be transported to the territorial orphanage, where he can be properly civilized." Jake knew what that meant. The territorial orphanage was little more than a prison where Native American children were systematically stripped of their cultural identity, forbidden to speak their native languages, and often subjected to brutal treatment designed to kill the Indian and save the man. "Please," Jake said, taking a step forward, "let me keep him. I'll sign any papers you want. take any legal responsibility. He's happy here, he's healthy, Morrison's fist caught Jake across the jaw, sending him staggering backward. You'll shut your mouth, Thornfield, before I decide to charge you with treason, as well as violation of territorial law. As Morrison's men prepared to leave with Danny, Tom Bradley approached Jake with an expression that mixed embarrassment with resolve. I'm sorry, Jake, Tom said quietly. But when Mrs. Henderson mentioned the baby supplies you'd been buying, and when we started putting the pieces together, well, we had to report it. You can't just take Indian children and raise them like they're white. It's not natural, and it's not legal. Jake stared at his neighbor with a mixture of anger and disbelief. So you decided to destroy a child's life to satisfy your prejudices. We decided to uphold the law, Tom replied stiffly. Indians belong with Indians, and whites belong with whites. That's just the way things are. As the men mounted their horses and prepared to ride away with Danny, Jake made a desperate decision. He couldn't stop them from taking the child, but he could try to follow them and find some way to help Danny escape from whatever fate awaited him. This isn't over, Morrison, Jake called out as the militia captain secured Danny in front of his saddle. Morrison turned back with a cold smile. Oh, yours, but it is Thornfield, and if you try to interfere with the proper disposal of this child, you'll find yourself facing charges that could put you in prison for the rest of your life. As the riders disappeared down the trail toward Clearwater Falls, Jake stood alone in his empty ranch yard, consumed by rage and despair. In less than an hour, his entire world had been destroyed, and the child he had come to love like a son was being carried away to face a future that Jake couldn't bear to contemplate. But Jake Thornfield was not a man who gave up easily. As he watched the dust cloud from the departing horses fade into the distance, he began to form a plan that would either save Danny or get them both killed in the attempt. What Jake didn't know was that the sound of Danny's crying had carried much farther than anyone realized, and that there were other ears listening in the wilderness, ears that belonged to people who had been searching for the missing child for nearly 7 months. The reckoning was coming, and it would arrive with the dawn. Chapter 4. The Silent Vigil. Jake spent the remainder of that terrible day preparing for what he was certain would be his final act as Danny's protector. He cleaned and loaded his rifles, gathered supplies for what might be a long pursuit, and wrote a letter explaining his actions for whoever might find his body. He had no illusions about his chances of successfully rescuing Danny from territorial custody, but he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. As darkness fell, Jake saddled Duke and prepared to ride toward Clearwater Falls, intending to intercept Morrison's party before they could reach the territorial capital. He had no clear plan beyond following them and waiting for an opportunity to act, but he was determined to try something, anything, to save the child who had become the center of his world. Jake was checking his rifle one final time when Duke suddenly raised his head and stared intently toward the northern ridge that overlooked the ranch. The horse's ears were pricked forward, and his entire body was tense with alertness. "Foister, what is it, boy?" Jake whispered, following the horse's gaze. At first, Jake saw nothing in the moonless darkness, but gradually, his eyes began to pick out shapes that didn't belong to the natural landscape, the silhouettes of mounted figures arranged along the ridgeline like sentries. As his vision adjusted, Jake realized with growing amazement that the entire northern ridge was lined with riders, their motionless forms barely visible against the star-filled sky. More riders appeared on the eastern ridge, then the western, until Jake found himself surrounded by what appeared to be a massive gathering of mounted warriors. They made no sound, showed no lights, and gave no indication of their intentions, but their presence was unmistakable and overwhelming. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, then stopped as he realized the futility of such a gesture. Even if these were hostile forces, he was so outnumbered that resistance would be pointless. More importantly, something about the silent vigil of the mounted figures suggested that they were not here as enemies. As Jake watched in fascination and growing hope, a single rider detached himself from the group on the northern ridge and began to descend toward the ranch house. The rider moved slowly and deliberately, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. As he drew closer, Jake could see that he was a Native American warrior of perhaps 50 years, his long hair braided with feathers, and his face painted with symbols that seemed to catch and reflect the starlight. The warrior rode to within 20 feet of where Jake stood and dismounted, his movements graceful despite his apparent age. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise, though heavily accented. "You are the man called Jake Thornfield," the warrior said. It was not a question. "I am," Jake replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I am called Standing Bear," the warrior continued. "I am war chief of the Blackfoot Nation, and I speak for the child you call Danny." Jake felt his knees nearly buckle with the sudden surge of hope and relief. "You know about Danny?" Standing Bear nodded gravely. "The child you saved is known to us by another name, Little Wolf. He is the son of my sister, lost to us during a raid by white soldiers 7 months ago. We have been searching for him since that dark day, following rumors and whispers across the territory. Morrison took him, Jake said urgently. Captain Morrison and his militia. They're taking him to the territorial orphanage, but they might still be on the trail. Standing Bear raised a hand to stop Jake's words. We know of Captain Morrison, he said quietly. We have been watching his movements for many days, waiting for the right moment to act. The child is safe. Jake stared at the war chief in confusion. Safe? But Captain Morrison and his men encountered an unfortunate accident approximately 1 hour ago, Standing Bear said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Their horses were spooked by a prairie fire that appeared quite suddenly in their path. In the confusion, the child was rescued by unknown parties. Jake felt a surge of joy so intense it was almost painful. Danny's safe. He's really safe? The child is with his grandmother even now, Standing Bear confirmed. She weeps with joy to hold her grandson again and to know that he has been well cared for during his time away from his people. Jake nodded, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. But as the initial euphoria faded, he realized that this moment marked the end of his relationship with the child he had come to love as his own son. I'm glad he's safe, Jake said quietly. That's all that matters. Standing Bear studied Jake's face for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to see into the rancher's very soul. You love the child, he observed. More than my own life, Jake admitted. And he loves you, Standing Bear replied. When we found him, he was crying not from fear or pain, but from being separated from the man he knows as his father. He speaks your name even now. Jake felt tears welling in his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. He's better off with his real family, he said, with people who can teach him about his heritage and his culture. Yes, Standing Bear agreed. But he is also better off for having known the love of a man like you. The war chief paused, choosing his words carefully. My people have watched you for many months, Jake Thornfield. We have seen how you cared for Little Wolf, how you protected him at great cost to yourself. We know of your kindness, your courage, and your honor. Jake didn't know how to respond to such praise, so he simply nodded his acknowledgement. Standing Bear continued. In our culture, a man who saves the life of a child and raises him as his own becomes part of that child's family forever. You are now and always will be Little Wolf's father in the eyes of our people, just as you will always be our brother. I don't understand, Jake said. Standing Bear gestured toward the silent figures that still lined the ridges around the ranch. We have come to honor you, Jake Thornfield. Every warrior you see has volunteered to stand guard over your ranch tonight, to show our respect for what you have done. We ask nothing in return except your friendship and your promise that you will always be part of Little Wolf's life. Jake looked around at the incredible sight of hundreds of mounted warriors maintaining their silent vigil, and he felt humbled by the magnitude of the honor being shown to him. Will I be able to see Danny again? Jake asked hesitantly. Little Wolf will spend much of his childhood with his blood family, learning the ways of our people, Standing Bear replied, but he will also spend time here, with you, learning the ways of both worlds. We believe that a child who understands both cultures will be stronger than one who knows only one. Jake felt his heart soar with the realization that he wasn't losing Danny forever, but rather gaining an extended family and a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly belong to something greater than himself. There is more, Standing Bear said. Our scouts report that Captain Morrison has filed charges against you with the territorial government. You are wanted for interfering with official business and harboring an Indian child. Jake's brief moment of joy was tempered by the reality of his legal situation. I suppose I'll have to face those charges eventually. Standing Bear shook his head. No, Captain Morrison will not be filing any charges. It seems that during the unfortunate incident with the prairie fire, the captain suffered a head injury that has affected his memory. He cannot recall anything about visiting your ranch or finding any Indian child. Jake understood the implication, and while he didn't ask for details, he felt a sense of justice in knowing that Morrison would face no consequences for his cruel intentions toward Danny. As the night progressed, Standing Bear shared stories of his people's culture and history, helping Jake understand the world that Danny would be growing up in. In return, Jake told Standing Bear about his own life, his dreams for the ranch and his hopes for Danny's future. As dawn approached, Standing Bear prepared to rejoin his warriors for the journey back to their tribal lands. But before he left, he placed a hand on Jake's shoulder and spoke words that would remain with the rancher for the rest of his life. You gave our child not just food and shelter, but love and protection when he had no one else. For this you will always be honored among our people. And when Little Wolf grows to be a man, he will tell his own children about the brave white rancher who risked everything to save a native child, teaching them that courage and compassion know no boundaries of race or culture. Chapter 5. Brothers in Honor. As the sun crested the eastern horizon, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Jake witnessed one of the most extraordinary sights of his life. Without a word or signal that he could detect, the hundreds of mounted warriors who had maintained their silent vigil throughout the night began to move as one. They didn't simply ride away. They performed what Jake later learned was a traditional honor ceremony, rarely witnessed by anyone outside their tribe. Each group of warriors rode in precise formations around the ranch, their horses' hooves creating a rhythmic thunder that seemed to make the very earth pulse with life. Standing Bear had explained that this was called the Circle of Brothers, a ceremony reserved for those who had demonstrated extraordinary courage and honor in defense of the tribe's children. As the warriors completed their circuits around the ranch, many of them raised their weapons skyward in salute, their war cries echoing across the landscape like a song of victory and brotherhood. Jake stood in his ranch yard, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the honor being shown to him. He had never felt more humble or more proud than he did in that moment, watching these proud people pay tribute to his simple act of compassion. As the last of the warriors disappeared over the ridges, Standing Bear remained behind with a small group of his most trusted men. Approaching Jake one final time, the war chief carried a bundle wrapped in the finest buffalo hide Jake had ever seen. "This is for you," Standing Bear said, offering the bundle to Jake, a gift from Little Wolf's grandmother, made with her own hands during the long months when she mourned his loss. Jake unwrapped the bundle to reveal a magnificent shirt made of the softest deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of a child saved by a stranger's kindness. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with every bead placed with perfect precision and every design element carrying deep cultural significance. "I can't accept something this valuable," Jake protested. "You must, Miss," Standing Bear replied firmly. "To refuse would dishonor the woman who made it and the child whose story it tells. You will wear this shirt when you visit our people, so that all may know you as Little Wolf's adopted father and our honored brother." As Standing Bear prepared to mount his horse, he turned to Jake with a serious expression. "There is one more thing you must know. The territorial government will likely send investigators to verify Morrison's report about finding no Indian child here. You must be prepared to answer their questions carefully." Jake nodded his understanding. "What should I tell them?" "Tell them the truth," Standing Bear replied with a slight smile. "That you know nothing about any Indian child, and that Captain Morrison must have been mistaken. His head injury, after all, has left his memory quite unreliable." As Standing Bear and his remaining warriors rode away, Jake found himself alone once again, but profoundly changed by the events of the past 18 hours. The empty ranch house that had once felt like a home now seemed like a hollow shell, missing the laughter and energy that Danny had brought to it. But Jake's loneliness didn't last long. 3 days later, as he was working on repairs to his barn roof, he saw a small group of riders approaching from the north. His heart leaped as he recognized Standing Bear, accompanied by 2 women and a small figure that could only be Danny. Jake climbed down from the roof and waited in his yard as the riders approached. Danny, now dressed in traditional Native American clothing that had been tailored to his small size, was riding in front of one of the women, his dark eyes scanning the familiar landscape with obvious excitement. The moment the horses stopped, Danny began squirming and reaching toward Jake, babbling excitedly in a mixture of English and what Jake now recognized as Blackfoot words. The woman holding him, clearly his grandmother, smiled warmly and helped the child down from the horse. Danny ran toward Jake on unsteady legs, his arms outstretched and his face radiant with joy. Jake swept the child up into his arms, holding him close and feeling the hole in his heart begin to heal. "Jake! Jake!" Danny babbled, patting Jake's cheeks with his small hands as if to make sure his beloved protector was real. Standing Bear dismounted and approached with the 2 women. "Jake Thornfield," he said formally, "I would like you to meet Singing Bird, Little Wolf's grandmother, and Morning Star, his aunt. They have come to thank you personally for saving their grandson and nephew." The older woman, Singing Bird, stepped forward and spoke in her native language, her voice rich with emotion. Standing Bear translated her words. "She says that you have given her the greatest gift possible, the return of her grandson's life. She says that your kindness has shown her that there are good hearts among all peoples, and that this gives her hope for the future." Jake felt overwhelmed by the warmth and gratitude in the woman's eyes. Through Standing Bear, he replied, "Tell her that Danny, Little Wolf, gave me just as much as I gave him. He brought joy back into my life when I thought I had lost it forever." As Singing Bird listened to the translation, tears gathered in her eyes, and she reached out to touch Jake's face gently, speaking softly in Blackfoot. "She says you will always be welcome in our lodge," Standing Bear translated, and that little wolf will grow up knowing he has two families who love him. Over the next several hours, Jake learned more about Danny's heritage and the plans for his future. The child would spend the majority of his time with his Blackfoot family, learning their language, customs, and traditions. But he would also spend several weeks each year with Jake, maintaining the bond they had formed and learning about the world beyond the reservation. We believe that Little Wolf's future lies in understanding both worlds, Standing Bear explained, as they sat around Jake's kitchen table sharing a meal. The time of our people living in complete isolation is ending. Those who can bridge both cultures will be the leaders and teachers of tomorrow. Jake was amazed by the wisdom and forward-thinking nature of Standing Bear's vision. Rather than trying to keep Danny isolated from white culture, the Blackfoot leader was embracing the idea that exposure to both worlds would make the child stronger and more adaptable. As the day progressed, Jake watched with fascination as Danny interacted with his Blackfoot family. The child clearly remembered and loved his grandmother and aunt, but he also showed no hesitation in returning to Jake whenever he wanted comfort or reassurance. It was as if Danny instinctively understood that he now belonged to both families equally. Before the visitors prepared to leave, Singing Bird presented Jake with another gift, a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be herbs and other natural materials. Medicine, Standing Bear explained. Singing Bird is renowned among our people as a healer. She has prepared remedies that will help you stay healthy and strong, so that you will be able to care for Little Wolf for many years to come. Jake was deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift and the implication that these people were planning for a long-term relationship rather than a temporary arrangement. As evening approached and the time came for Danny's family to depart, Jake felt the familiar ache of separation, but this time it was tempered by the knowledge that the separation was temporary and that Danny would return. Standing Bear seemed to understand Jake's emotions. The first separation is always the hardest, he said quietly. But with each visit, it becomes easier, because you learn to trust in the bond that cannot be broken by distance or time. Danny clung to Jake as his grandmother prepared to lift him onto her horse, his small arms wrapped tightly around Jake's neck. Jake whispered promises that he would see him soon, that he would always be there when Danny needed him, and that their connection would never be broken. As the riders disappeared into the gathering dusk, Jake stood in his yard feeling a complex mixture of sadness and hope. The silence of the ranch seemed profound after the laughter and conversation of the day, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of possibility and anticipation for future visits. True to Standing Bear's promise, territorial investigators did arrive at Jake's ranch 2 weeks later. They were bureaucratic men from the capital, who asked detailed questions about Captain Morrison's report and searched the property thoroughly for any evidence of an Indian child. Jake answered their questions honestly, telling them he knew nothing about any Indian child and suggesting that Captain Morrison's head injury might have caused him to imagine things that weren't real. The investigators found no evidence to contradict Jake's story, and they left, apparently satisfied that Morrison's report had been the product of a confused mind. As the months passed, Jake settled into a new rhythm of life that was both familiar and completely transformed. His daily routine of ranch work remained largely unchanged, but now it was punctuated by regular visits from Danny and his Blackfoot family. These visits became the highlights of Jake's existence, bringing joy and purpose to his otherwise solitary life. During Danny's visits, Jake taught him practical skills like riding horses, caring for cattle, and basic carpentry. In return, Danny shared stories and songs he was learning from his Blackfoot family, gradually teaching Jake about Native American culture and traditions. Jake was amazed by how quickly Danny was developing as a bilingual and bicultural child. The boy moved effortlessly between English and Blackfoot, between traditional Native American games and the activities of ranch life, between the spiritual teachings of his tribal elders and the practical lessons Jake provided. As Danny grew older, he began to serve as an unofficial bridge between Jake and the broader Blackfoot community. Through the child, Jake was gradually introduced to other tribal members and invited to participate in certain ceremonies and celebrations that were traditionally closed to outsiders. Jake learned to appreciate the sophisticated social structures, spiritual beliefs, and practical knowledge that governed Blackfoot society. His respect for Native American culture deepened with each interaction, replacing his previous ignorance with genuine understanding and admiration. The relationship that had begun with a simple act of compassion had evolved into something far greater, a genuine bridge between two cultures that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Jake had become living proof that people of different races and backgrounds could not only coexist, but actually enrich each other's lives through mutual respect and understanding. Years later, As Jake watched Danny grow into a confident young man who moved comfortably in both worlds, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with finding a crying infant beside Willow Creek. That moment of decision to help a helpless child had not only saved a life but had also transformed Jake himself, giving him a family, a purpose, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly human. The silent warriors who had stood guard over his ranch that memorable dawn had honored Jake for his courage and compassion, but Jake knew that he had received far more than he had given. In saving Danny, he had ultimately saved himself, discovering that the greatest treasures in life came not from individual achievement, but from the bonds of love and loyalty that connected all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the culture of their birth.